let's try and dig a little bit deeper into the presentations today. And we have, in addition to the great presenters today, we are honored to have with us Dr. Patrick Caron. And I would like to take a few moments to introduce Dr. Caron. So Dr. Caron currently serves as the Vice Chair of CGIAR's Integrated Partnership Board. And he brings extensive experience at the intersection of science and policy, with a distinguished career at CIAT, a French agricultural research organization active in over 100 countries, if I'm not wrong. He currently directs the Montpellier Institute for Advanced Knowledge. He also presides over Agropolis International. So Dr. Caron's experience also includes many global roles, such as chair of the high-level panel of experts on food security and nutrition under the UN, with advanced degrees in geography, food and nutrition, public health, and veterinary medicine. He brings a well-rounded perspective to today's discussion on inclusive agriculture and innovation. So thank you. We are really honored to have you here today. Our other panelists, I'm not going to reintroduce them because we already know them. So I'll start by asking one question to each of our panelists today, and then open the floor to the audience for more questions. So Dr. Caron, given your extensive experience working at the intersection of science and policy, how do you think CGIAR and its partners can ensure that food systems transformation is truly inclusive, addressing the needs of marginalized communities and underrepresented groups? Are there specific approaches that you believe hold promise?
Thank you very much to ISDC for the invitation. That's great discussion. And congratulations to all editors and to all authors of the special issue. It's always something very difficult to produce a special issue, and this is particularly relevant as far as I understand for an impact-oriented research institution like CGIAR. It's very important for at least well, there are several reasons, but I look at inclusive innovation, and I will come back on that. It's because of the impact orientation. It's very clear now with the new strategy of CGIAR that the social outcome is also part of what is expected. It's when we look at the 5 impact areas of the new strategy, top on the agenda, there is the social inequity and poverty reduction, and there is the gender and inclusion objective. So there is absolutely no doubt that it's important. It's important for CGIAR, it's important as well for the research institutions. Not only for the fun of rhetorics, but I will come back to the definition just very shortly of inclusive innovation. And the word truly in the question you ask me, I don't think there is any innovation that is not inclusive. It's just a provocation, because innovation is not technology. Innovation is a process of implementation. And as far as it is implemented, it means that people have owned it. So what we are looking at is not that much inclusive innovation. It was, as you really very remarkably identifying the definition, what we are looking at is innovation that promote inclusiveness and promote social positive outcome, which is slightly different and called for us to make a difference between technology and innovation, and probably a better difference between technology and innovation, in particular when we want to manage the portfolio. So, well, if there is any interest, and Erin has demonstrated that very well, if there is any interest today to look at inclusive-oriented innovation, as I would call it, it's first of all because there is somehow, it's because of the impact we are looking at, number one. It's also because there is a rejection somehow that science and technology would be neutral. It's not that neutral. It's the way we design technology, the way we can access the technology. Remember the graph in the tree, and people did not access the technology. The unintended consequences, the social differentiation of technology does matter. So there is one reason is we look at positive outcome. There is another reason we have to be reflexive as scientists on what we are doing and what are the consequences. And this brings me exactly to the reflexivity and the role of scientists. When looking at science policy interface in different fora, we identified 3 main pillars that do matter to do that. The first one is the importance for scientists to produce actionable knowledge. To produce actionable knowledge, to make action knowledgeable. And this is not just the information about the technology. This is also to identify the obstacles to change, to obstacle the power asymmetry or the agencies that make innovation possible, to begin to think about intended and unintended consequences, to think about conflict of interest, to look at those obstacles to change and identify them, as I said, and to look at what is the cost and the risk of moving towards change. And there is a huge responsibility for science to look at that, not just to leave it to development agencies. This is what actionable is about. The second issue is that most of the innovation have a collective dimension. It's not just one individual who innovate. And that means that we have to, and those stakeholders have all different interests, vested interests, do not necessarily agree. We know that the most important innovation are usually controversial. And we have to create what we call risky safe space. At risk. That is how to build institutional arrangements where we can look at controversies, move them out of polemics. We don't know why we disagree, but we disagree and we fight to each other. So let's first agree on disagreement and maybe begin to design an agreement, for very probably in the beginning, disagreeing on the agreement and then through negotiation, moving towards agreement on agreement. So those risky safe space to be implemented are very important. And it's not just something out of science. This is something that scientists can engage in. And the third one that was also well noted in the presentation, it's the stakeholders do not all have the same capacity, and usually they do not have the same voices in agency and in innovation processes. And it's very important to make sure, because the SDG, the Agenda 2030 is about focusing primarily on the most vulnerable, is to make sure that those who do not have a voice in transformation processes can have a voice and can access the change and the transformation process. So Actionable knowledge, institutional arrangement, capacity strengthening. These are the three pillars, and somehow I will finish with that. We tested that in many different setups. In my mother institution, we've worked quite a lot on territorial development and the concept of territorial development, that is how to have a social innovation process at the level of a landscape or a territory because of the proximity of the actors and their capacity to design a collective project for the future. This is also an innovation. But then more recently, rather than just scaling up, and I would, if I had half an hour more, I would build on that, but rather than just scaling up, that is moving from local to global, we try to build, and CGIAR is very strongly engaged in that, what we call, because the first meeting took place there, the Montpellier process, which is how to pool collective intelligence to make innovation at the local level, but also at the national or at the global, and not just scaling up, but articulating those different processes.
Thank you for your deep insights and sharing with us your long and valuable experience today. I personally, I liked your idea of risky safe space. I think this is very, very important for making our innovations genuinely inclusive. And yeah, we need to first agree on what we disagree before actually we design our innovation. So this is really important. Thank you again. And if we have time in the end, we might come back and ask you more difficult questions. Okay, so thank you. My next question is to our distinguished panelist, Dr. Nompumelelo Obokoh. So thank you for your paper. I could not agree more with the final conclusion of your paper that inclusive innovation is not possible without institutional change. However, institutions are very difficult to change. They're like old dogs. They don't change so often and so easily. And to identify strategies as to how we can instigate institutional change, your paper suggests some ideas. And one of the ideas is learning while doing. And to promote that, you also highlight the importance of exploring incentive mechanisms. So could you please elaborate on whose incentives need to be aligned and what specific forms of incentives might drive institutional change? A related question is, are there practical examples where this has worked effectively? So actually, although I'm saying that I have asked you one question, there are three questions actually. So if you could please share your experience, thoughts on that. Thank you.
Now, thank you very much for the engagement, and maybe just as an observation as well, as we dwell on this very important topic, is that, you know, the discussions as well as the presentation were quite complementary, you know, building on each other to ensure that at the end we've got a more holistic picture, you know, starting at the concept level, the general, and then building it up until we're more specific, and context specificity, I think, was very much key for me. And then now, you know, delving on the institutional change, as we indicated, the 4 strategies that we have looked into, starting with how we're navigating trade-offs, the partnerships, but also the measurements, because that is where now we are looking at learning by doing. So there must be evidence accumulated over the years that will now, you know, be utilized to say with the institutions, this is the strategy overall on inclusive or innovation that is inclusive. Then how, therefore, do we ensure that through these evidence and the learnings over the years, we can now have that paradigm shift and be able to incentivize our researchers, because they are the core. But as they are doing that, they have to do it in an inclusive manner. So a critical example, as we're busy looking at the entire portfolio for the CG, and also with the core design as the very important aspect of it, that is where we are looking at how do we do it inclusively, engaging especially our small-scale farmers, the youth, the marginalized, as it was talked about earlier, to ensure that we've got a more inclusive approach. So when you talked about the incentives, these are the key stakeholders. So that whole value chain, what are the expectations out there by the stakeholders, and how therefore are we meeting those expectations? Because for us to measure the effectiveness and what is the success after those interventions, then it must be that all those boxes are ticked, and the stakeholders, they are able to see the impact at the end of the day that has been done through those various interventions. So for me, it's not a one fit or blanket approach, but we need to be looking at various aspects and the entire value chain, and ensuring that it's more systematic, but also a multidisciplinary approach as we move along. So those are some of the inputs which I thought will also add to the discussion. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Obokoh. Yes, it's really important that we respond to the expectations of all stakeholders across the value chains. So that can be a great way to create incentives, and that might lead to institutional change. So that's a very insightful idea. Thank you for that. And particularly, I like your idea of measuring impacts in a way that convinces stakeholders. This is also very important. And your paper touches on that as well, if I remember correctly. So this is really, really important. And that's why it's important for us also to have proper indicators and metrics and methods of measuring and quantifying those, so that we can visualize and demonstrate. That can be a great incentive for institutional change. So thank you for that. Now let's turn to our next panelist, Dr. Marc Schut. My question to you is, from your paper, I understand that you have been heavily involved directly with the development of the new innovation portfolio management system within CGIAR. And it's great. I checked it myself. And particularly, I found the results dashboard as also very interesting and very useful. And within that, I saw some data, probably for the first time, on innovation readiness and this kind of things. And also the tagging were particularly helpful. For example, I found that, please correct me if I'm wrong, over 50% of the innovations don't have a gender tagging. And that immediately caught my eye, that why it should be the case. So I found this dashboard really, really interesting. And within that dashboard, your new innovation portfolio management system was very, very interesting and useful. So thank you for that. Now, my question is about its adoption. So as an insider who has been directly involved with it, can you share with us any information as to how widely this new system has been adopted, particularly by users in developing countries, where we know serious capacity deficiencies may exist? And have you encountered any significant challenges in the implementation of this new system? And what steps are being taken to address those? Thank you.
There is a lot of things that we can and need to improve. That's also one of the reasons why the collaboration with Erin, for example, we're really trying to, work together and remain critical. I think that's what we need. Erin is very good at punching holes in things, And then we say like, okay, let's sit together and let's see where we can improve. Where we sometimes also bump into, the appetite for change, because what we also see is that when you institutionalize, you also have to do with all kinds of organizational politics, preferences, and people's willingness to defend a radical an approach that is quite different from the business as usual. So to use our own typologies, like sometimes we want to be radical, but the pathway is to be incremental. And I think that's where we are constantly trying to balance, like where we would love to be and what we think is feasible, and doing it step by step. I'm also very happy that Patrick is in the room, because one of the things that we are struggling with is that we do have much better insights now on the innovation portfolio, but what we are struggling with is to really get leadership on board in guiding us. And that example that I gave on risk appetite of the portfolio now being more or less like a 70% incremental, 20% radical, and 10% disruptive. We don't really know whether this aligns with what leadership wants it to be. And the same for the gender tag, for example, that you mentioned. Maybe the organization says, well, if 50% of our innovations has a specific gender focus, that's more than enough. Or maybe they say, no, we need to go towards 80%. And then you can have discussions about like, okay, how are we going to incentivize that? Like what you're also saying, like how are we going to maybe redirect resources from innovations that are not gender tagged towards those innovations that are gender tagged. And I think that's a discussion that we really need to have. And the start of the new portfolio is probably a very good entry point for that. Many of those people that are in leadership positions, of course, they have tons of things on their minds, but getting clear direction and then managing against is also something that the founders are really keen on. They don't want to manage each individual innovation, but they want to know, like, okay, what is your compass? What is the dot on the horizon, and how do you manage your investments so that they are confident that there is a strategy and a vision? And now, with regards to that, is, let's say, the internal use of the kind of information. The use of the information by external partners is it differs a lot. Like in some cases, we were in a room the day before yesterday. We asked people like who is using this results dashboard. Unfortunately, there was quite a lot of external partners who are then looking for, like, okay, we have an issue on vitamin A deficiency in Malawi. Like, what has CGIAR? What is out there that we can use, or that we can start having a discussion around? For each of these innovations, we have contact persons identified. So it happens that people like get an email from somebody in the ministry says like, I want to have a discussion with you on that. So there is use. I'm not going to say that we get 1,000 contact requests per day. That's not where it is. But it is being used. One last thing I would like to say is that together with World Bank, we have been looking at whether we can develop capacity in the 6 countries where ICRA is active in Africa. ICRA is a program that's specifically focusing on scaling climate innovations, to develop something similar, but then more at the country level. Like some of the countries where we work, like they have immense agriculture innovation systems, where the NARS, but also private sector development organizations and CGIAR are developing all kinds of new solutions to problems. But in many cases within the government, there's no capacity to manage those innovations and to know like what to boost, what to drop, and etc. So we're also looking at like, can we replicate some of the work that we are doing, but then more at national or regional level. So it's a process. It's not there yet, but I think we're making good progress.
Dr. Schut, it's great to know that it's been used actually. So that's very important, because we develop sometimes very, very new fantastic systems, but then we see that unfortunately, colleagues are not using it, and that's heartbreaking, particularly when you are involved with that. So yeah, it's great to know that actually things are in the positive direction. I mean, I particularly personally, I liked the inclusion of, failed or negative projects. But I worry that that might actually increase the pushback, because for some reason, I don't know, for whatever mysterious reasons, we don't like negative feedback. And we always try to prove that our projects and interventions have made statistically significantly positive impact on beneficiary livelihoods. So it's a great initiative, and it's very important that we learn from our failures too. So thank you for taking this brave initiative, and I wish you all the best with your system. So thank you. Now my next question is to Dr. Song. Your study highlights the urgent need for anticipatory policies to address the growing risk of climate-related conflicts in linguistically diverse regions. What specific strategies would you recommend for policymakers to mitigate these risks effectively? Are there examples of successful anticipatory measures that could guide this process?
To the best of our knowledge, we really don't see many very successful examples that are at the intersection of anticipatory action, climate information services, conflict resolution, and also language learning, communal dialogue, or things that promote mutual learning across language groups. So if you imagine a Venn diagram at the intersection of those keywords, there are very limited successful examples. One recent example that we're aware of is actually in Kenya, in the Tana Delta region. We know there's a IUCN project that promote communication and mutual learning in areas where there are anticipated land degradation. So this is one way to promote better community-based participatory approach in managing the land together, and then also resource sharing, where we anticipate to see more threat to those resources. So that's one example we are aware of. Other example, happy to learn more for those that have experience, but we really don't see many cases, which also suggests there's a gap to promote in those areas. Now, going back to your first question, in terms of specific recommendations, besides what we mentioned in, for example, if your target beneficiary area is a mixed language zone, that means there are additional complexity the innovation needs to account. A direct recommendation would be the interface of the climate monitoring or early warning system might need to have multiple languages depending on who do you consider the major actors. So that requires probably a pre-survey in the area to understand better who are involved in potential conflicts, so to cater to their needs. The other is to integrate more short-term interventions, such as early warning, which is rather the next week or next month anticipatory approach, to something more structural and long-term. So that will be another recommendation we give, because a lot of the community-based approach does take a lot of time to generate effects. So it takes some maybe foresight to have those planning when you have the anticipatory framework. So that's kind of a short-term versus more structural intervention together. So that would be what we take away from the paper that we worked on. So, but thank you. That's a great question.
We all know that how important conflict is today, particularly when we are talking about tackling food insecurity, because reports after reports after reports are telling us that the food insecure are mostly concentrated now in conflict affected areas. So this is really important. And we see an interesting mix here, that these areas also tend to be affected by climatic changes, particularly drought. So it's really important for us to identify options and solutions to tackle this challenge. It's a complex challenge, isn't it? So thank you for your insights. I hope policymakers whoever are listening to this event today would be able to identify action areas from your suggestions. So thank you for that. My final question is to Dr. McGuire. I really enjoyed your opening of your presentation, that do agricultural AR4D actors really like social theories? The answer is they don't. at least this is what I have learned from my experience as well. They want quick solutions, so they don't have time to bother about theories. But this is really, really important, and thank you for your very useful paper. So your framework, your equity framework, identifies 3 categories of agricultural innovation system actors, if I remember correctly. So my question to you relates to these categories of actors. So it's about the application of your equity principles into practice. So who is going to bell the bell? That's the question. So what specific roles do these actors, particularly the funders and donors, need to play in implementing your suggested equity principles effectively? And can you share with us any example from the horticulture sector in which I believe you have lots of experience? Thank you, Dr. McGuire.
Thank you so much. Yeah, thanks for the question. So when the equity principles certainly lay out different actors and talk about power dynamics. And I can give you sort of a practical example of how we have engaged the equity principles at the Horticulture Innovation Lab. So for those of you that don't know, the Feed the Future Innovation Labs, there's about 20, they're funded by USAID, and each of them have their own mission around soybeans, particular crops, particular parts of the value chain. So of course we focus on fruits and vegetables. And one of the unique aspects about the Feed the Future Innovation Labs is that you're given your funding from USAID. We get 15 million, which perhaps is not a lot in some settings, but for us, it's a good amount. And you really get to control that budget. You get to decide how you're going to manage those research funds, how you're going to grant them out, how you're going to prioritize different challenges and different solutions. So at the Horticulture Innovation Lab at UC Davis, for instance, we are a funder, ultimately. And we, for the first 10 years that we had the Horticulture Innovation Lab, we followed a very traditional way of granting out funds. We put out a call for what we thought, from UC Davis perspective, were the biggest challenges within horticulture in West and East Africa, South Asia, and Central America. And then we required that the main applicant be a US-based university, and it was their charge to carry out that research with implementing partners who are often, honestly, data collectors. They weren't the lead on any of the papers. They weren't leading the challenge identification or the solution identification. Now, we, in our 3rd round of the Horticulture Innovation Lab, which I got to play a large role in determining, and of course I care a lot about the equity principles, we've changed that funding structure so that the lead applicant can only be researchers and entities from the regions in which we're doing this research. So only applicants from West and East Africa, South Asia, and Central America can now be the lead. So we went from 100% of our funding going to US-based entities to now 93% of our funding going directly to researchers in the country that we think ultimately will better affect and have a better impact on end users, because those researchers are more closely understand the landscape, the context, which has been brought up over and over again. There is no way that the UC Davis has a better idea of the context than University of Ghana, who now leads our West Africa research portfolio. So we think that our challenge identification is going to be much better. We think our solutions will be more responsive and more scalable because the partners are at the table from the very beginning. So one example.
For the sake of time, we don't have the opportunity to ask more questions to our panelists. But if anyone has a very, very urgent or burning question in the audience.
Going back to the challenge that you faced when you tried to collect articles, contributions from different backgrounds, cultures, languages, and it was a problem. So what are, maybe we can use this opportunity to hear what are the best practices that in the future to overcome this challenge. Is translation an option or solution to collect contribution in different languages for the journal and then translate, or are there other options that we could use?
Researchers sometimes don't really focus on communication, and being able to reach out to the correct audiences. For example, we for this special issue, we did all the background to get the word out. Normally for ag systems, I think they just put the call on their website and that's it. So if you're not actively looking for those opportunities, you won't find it. But a problem today is that there's so many journals out there, and some not that great, as many of you know. So you've kind of have to weed out those poor journals and really focus on the ones that are rigorous. But the barriers are there. A lot of it is just access to publications. Working at CGIAR, we're not a university. We don't necessarily have access to all the journals. So sometimes I have the firewall of not having access to, and I had to have Mofa or Holger, who were affiliated with universities, to download the publications when I couldn't. So I think the access problem is huge. And these journals are for profit. And I don't have an answer for that. I'd love to hear other people's opinions of this.
I'll be very, very quick. It's not just only about translation and publication. And intercultural psychologists very well demonstrate that we do not think the same way from one culture to another culture, from one language to another language. So it's also about partnership. It's also about working together across countries, across cultures, across languages, across disciplines in scientific terms. And this is also the best way to ensure the capacity to work together. Just to give an example, the word sustainable is not translatable in some languages. Just an example. And then the way to think is very different from one culture to another culture. And there is nothing that can substitute the capacity to design protocols, to experiment and to draw lessons, than working together. This is also one of the beauty of CGIAR and other institutions as well. And to look at SDG 17 in the area of science.
I think we are already more than 5 minutes over time. So I wish we had the whole afternoon to have more discussion. But if you have questions in your mind, our panelists are going to be around and available for you to have a one-to-one discussion. So please feel free to approach them. They're very approachable, lovely person. So they would be happy to discuss your questions with you. So finally, I would like to thank our panelists again. So let's put our hands together and thank them again for their really important contribution.